It was just another ordinary day in London. Tourists milled around Buckingham Palace, snapping pictures and chatting excitedly. The square was a sea of paper cups, camera flashes, and the faint hum of distant conversations. At the center of it all stood a royal guard, stoic and imposing, his uniform gleaming bright red in the afternoon sun. He was a living symbol of British tradition, unwavering, silent, and dignified. The crowd buzzed around him, some in awe, others with their phones out, eager to capture the perfect shot. "Look at that robot," a girl giggled, raising her selfie stick above the crowd, trying to get a photo with the guard in the background. And then, through the crowd, emerged a man who would shatter the calm. Dave, a 42-year-old tourist, was clearly drunk. His skin, burnt red from too many hours in the sun and too many beers, hung loosely over his pudgy body. He stumbled forward, barely able to keep his balance, his greasy hair a tangled mess. His eyes were glazed over, his movements jerky. As he swayed back and forth, a slurred voice broke the quiet hum of the crowd. "Check out this soldier boy." Dave rasped, pointing a pudgy finger at the guard. His words were barely intelligible, his breath thick with alcohol. The crowd around him shifted uneasily. Some tried to ignore him, others looked on with wide eyes, unsure how to react. The few who dared to turn their gaze on Dave looked at him with a mix of discomfort and disbelief. But Dave didn't care. He was enjoying the attention, the disapproving stares only egging him on. "Hey, bro. Forget how to have fun," he sneered, taking a stumbling step closer to the guard. His belly jiggled with every step, sweat dripping down his face as he moved in closer, almost dangerously so. The crowd was growing tense, their discomfort palpable, but Dave was too drunk to notice. The guard, however, remained unfazed. He stood like a statue, his eyes fixed ahead, his posture unyielding. His face, cold and impassive, gave nothing away. The drunk tourist, convinced that he could make the guard react, kept pressing on with his taunts. The tension in the air thickened, and a sense of unease began to creep through the crowd. They were waiting for something they feared might come, but no one could have predicted how far Dave would push. The air around Buckingham Palace had already begun to thrum with a strange tension. The crowd of tourists buzzed with excitement, oblivious to the brewing storm. But Dave, the drunken tourist, had zero regard for the tradition, the ceremony, or the people around him. He was far too busy with his own antics. Wobbling on his feet, his breath reeking of stale beer, Dave wasn't going to let the royal guard stand there without making a spectacle of himself. His movements were uncoordinated, and his words were slurred, but his confidence was a different story. It was as if he believed the world existed for his amusement. "What's the matter, soldier boy?" he jeered, lurching forward, dangerously close to the guard. He took a few steps, his beer belly jiggling with each movement, before throwing his arms in the air like he was on stage performing for a crowd. "Come on. Do something. Give me a show. I paid for this." His voice rang out, loud and obnoxious, cutting through the hum of whispers in the crowd. The tourists surrounding him shifted uneasily. Some glanced around nervously, unsure whether to step in, while others just stood there, watching the scene unfold with a sense of discomfort. His friends, if you could even call them that, seemed to shrink back, no longer sharing in the laugh. Despite his increasingly rude behavior, the guard didn't budge. His eyes remained fixed ahead, unblinking, as if nothing in the world could break his focus. His rigid stance made it clear that this was no casual performance for tourists. It was a tradition, a sacred duty, one that demanded respect. But that didn't matter to Dave. He was enjoying the power, the attention he was getting. The more the crowd shifted uncomfortably, the more he reveled in his own arrogance. Dave leaned in even closer, his breath hot and pungent. He almost stumbled into the guard, but caught himself at the last second, grinning like a maniac. "Oops, sorry there, buddy," he muttered, though the sarcasm was evident in his voice. "What's the matter? You need a hand to pick you up or something?" His smirk widened, and for a moment he looked almost like a child playing a prank. The crowd around him, once uncertain, now seemed to collectively hold their breath. They could feel something was about to snap. Was it going to be the drunk's endless taunting, or would the guard finally crack? The tension was unbearable, almost like the moment before a storm breaks. The line between respect and disrespect had been blurred, and it seemed that Dave's thirst for entertainment had clouded his judgment entirely. Around them, the whispers grew louder. "He's really pushing it," someone muttered. "This is disrespectful," said another. But still, the guard stood there, unflinching, like an ancient monument. He seemed impervious to everything, mockery, insults, and the growing unease in the air. He was a living embodiment of duty, and to him, nothing mattered except his unbroken focus on his role. Meanwhile, the drunken tourist seemed to be enjoying the effect his antics were having on the crowd, taking it all as some kind of victory. But that was before he took things too far. The guard's stillness was growing more pronounced, and Dave, emboldened by the silence, was about to push the boundaries even further. Dave's confidence continued to rise, fueled by the growing discomfort in the crowd around him. The more the tourists watched, the more Dave felt in control of the situation. He had been taunting the guard for minutes now, pushing boundaries, testing limits, and still, the guard remained as immovable as a statue. But that was exactly what Dave wanted. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the guard to break, to show he wasn't just a lifeless figure standing there. And if that meant pushing things further, so be it. "You're really just gonna stand there, huh?" Dave sneered, his words slurred. He took another unsteady step forward, his thick belly wobbling with each movement, closing the distance between himself and the guard. He had no idea how close he was to crossing a line he shouldn't. "You're nothing but a puppet in a costume," Dave continued, his voice growing louder, the audience around him bracing for the next verbal attack. "You just stand there all day, pretending you're important. Come on, give me something, show me you're alive." With a drunken, exaggerated sway, Dave leaned in, his face inches away from the guard's polished visor. The crowd tensed. This wasn't just a man mocking a statue anymore, it was something darker, something more dangerous. Some tourists turned away, too uncomfortable to watch, while others couldn't take their eyes off the unfolding scene. It was as if they were witnessing a train wreck, unable to look away despite the discomfort in their stomachs. Dave's breath was heavy, a mix of alcohol and taunting filling the air. The crowd around him could sense it was getting out of hand, but no one stepped in. The guard remained completely silent, a true testament to the discipline he was sworn to uphold. His gaze never shifted. His stance never wavered. For a moment, it felt like the whole square had held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Then, without warning, Dave did the unthinkable. With a cocky grin plastered on his face, he spat, a glob of viscous, drunk spit that flew from his mouth in slow motion, cutting through the tension in the air. Time seemed to freeze as the spit soared, each second stretching out as the crowd collectively gasped. It was almost like watching an awful slow-motion film, the moment hanging in the air, sickening and inevitable. Dave's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction, convinced that he had finally won. The spit landed directly on the guard's visor. A wave of disgust rippled through the crowd as people recoiled, some covering their mouths in horror. The slimy filth trickled down the perfect, cold metal, corroding the boundaries of honor and tradition in one simple act of disrespect. And still, the guard did nothing. His face was unreadable, but to those watching, it seemed as if time itself had stopped. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of the moment. The tourists were frozen, their eyes darting from Dave's triumphant face to the guard, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The spit, now on the guard's visor, was the breaking point, but the guard did not flinch, did not blink. It was at that moment when the crowd knew this wasn't just a funny tourist story, something was about to change. The guard was still. But beneath that stillness, something was shifting, something more dangerous than anyone realized. The moment the spit hit the guard's visor, the entire square seemed to hold its breath. For a second, there was nothing but silence, an unbearable stillness that hung in the air. The crowd was frozen, some too shocked to speak, others covering their faces in disbelief. Dave, standing smug and drunk, clearly thought he had won. His grin widened as he looked around, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. But the guard, unwavering, unmoving, remained a statue in the sea of tension, his expression cold and impassive. The spit, now slowly dripping down the perfectly polished surface of the visor, seemed to defy everything the guard stood for: discipline, duty, and honor. It was a direct assault on the centuries-old traditions he represented. The crowd waited for something, anything, to happen. Would the guard finally move? Would he lash out in anger or humiliation? But the guard did nothing. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his posture unbroken. He was the epitome of composure in the face of complete disrespect. And then, after what felt like an eternity, there was a barely perceptible shift. The guard's hand, which had remained motionless up until that point, slowly rose. The movement was so subtle it could have been overlooked, but to the crowd, it was electric. They watched in hushed silence as he reached for the handkerchief tucked neatly in his belt. Every motion was calculated, precise, as though he were preparing for a task of great importance. The simple act of retrieving the handkerchief seemed to carry the weight of centuries of tradition with it. With a cool, methodical precision, the guard wiped away the spit from his visor. Each touch of the handkerchief was deliberate, and the crowd watched in awe, some with wide eyes, others with a quiet, reverent respect. The disgusting mark of disrespect was being removed, but it wasn't just about cleaning the guard's face, it was about reclaiming his dignity. It was a quiet act of defiance against the drunken insolence that had just tried to stain it. Then, with the spit wiped away, the guard looked directly at Dave. His gaze was cold, his words as sharp as the chill of winter. "Did you think you were amusing?" he asked, his voice deep, controlled, and unwavering. "Now you will be known as the man who spat on centuries of honor." The words pierced the air, their weight landing squarely on Dave's shoulders. The drunken man's face instantly paled, the arrogance that had filled him moments earlier draining away like water through a cracked glass. His once proud grin faded, replaced by confusion and humiliation. He stumbled backward, his words faltering. I didn't mean. I was just," his voice trailed off, unable to form a coherent defense. The crowd, which had been holding its breath, now collectively exhaled. The disapproving stares from the onlookers turned to a unified expression of contempt. Dave's smugness had evaporated, replaced by a sickening realization of how far he had crossed the line. The moment he had dared to mock and disrespect the guard, someone who embodied the honor of a nation, he had sealed his fate. As the guard took a half-step forward, his movements sharp and purposeful, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. The atmosphere was thick with disdain as the guard's words rang out once more, "Leave." It was not a suggestion. It was an order. Dave, now utterly deflated, staggered back in shame, his arrogance completely gone. His body trembled as he tried to gather whatever dignity he had left. With a defeated sigh, Dave turned and began to walk away. His steps were slow, heavy, like he was walking through mud, each step a reminder of his complete humiliation. As he left the square, the crowd began to murmur, some nodding in approval, others whispering about the shocking turn of events they had just witnessed. But the guard, calm, composed, returned to his post, his face once again a mask of stone, his eyes unwavering. He was the embodiment of resilience, a symbol of something far greater than any drunken fool could ever understand. The moment would live on, not just in the square, but across the world, a reminder that honor cannot be bought or tarnished by arrogance. As Dave stumbled away, his face a dull shade of gray, the atmosphere in the square shifted. The crowd that had once stood in tense anticipation now seemed to collectively exhale, the heavy air of tension lifting ever so slightly. People began to speak in hushed tones, sharing looks of disbelief and disgust at what they had just witnessed. Dave, who had come to Buckingham Palace in search of entertainment, now found himself nothing more than the object of collective scorn. His once gloating expression had melted into something pitiful, his steps slow and clumsy, weighed down by the heavy burden of humiliation. The crowd, now filled with a mix of emotions, shifted their gaze from Dave to the guard, who had returned to his post without so much as a flicker of acknowledgement. The stillness of the guard, his unwavering discipline, was the only thing that seemed to hold the square together. It wasn't just the guard's physical presence that commanded respect, it was the silent authority he carried, the centuries of tradition and honor embodied in his stillness. While Dave had been the one to break the silence, it was the guard who had reestablished it, with a single step forward, a few cold, measured words, and a look that spoke volumes. Despite the gravity of the moment, the crowd was already beginning to talk. Some voiced their approval, applauding the guard's composure and his decision to stand his ground. He had it coming, one man murmured under his breath. That guy was asking for it the whole time. The general sentiment seemed to align with this, many agreeing that Dave had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed, that the guard had every right to respond the way he did. But among the murmurs of approval, there were a few voices that questioned the severity of the response. "Do you think it went too far?" one woman asked, her voice hesitant. "I mean, sure, he was disrespectful, but it's just a show, right?" Another person joined in, "Yeah, but there's a line. He shouldn't have gotten physical." The debate simmered in the background, with some people defending the guard's response as justified, while others wondered if things could have been handled differently. The opinions were divided, but one thing was clear: Dave had not only lost his dignity, he had become the center of a conversation about respect, boundaries, and the limits of tolerance. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the event began to take on a life of its own, far beyond the square. Videos of the confrontation had already begun to circulate online, shared across social media platforms, sparking a firestorm of reactions. Some praised the guard for his discipline and dignity, for showing that no amount of drunken insolence could break the honor of the royal guard. Others questioned whether such a violent response was necessary, even in the face of provocation. The incident ignited passionate debates on respect, civility, and the role of authority in a world that increasingly struggles to maintain boundaries. Back at his post, the guard remained unmoved, a figure of unshakable composure. His movements were mechanical as he adjusted his hat, checked his uniform, and resumed his eternal vigil. He had not just defended his post, he had defended something far greater, the respect due to the history and tradition he represented. His role had been tested, but he had passed with flying colors, undisturbed by the chaos around him. For the rest of the crowd, the image of Dave, slumped, defeated, and humiliated, would stay in their minds long after they left the square. And for Dave, he would likely never forget that moment. It was a harsh reminder that in the face of true discipline and honor, even the loudest voices and the most arrogant gestures can be silenced in an instant. What began as a drunken taunt had ended as a lesson in respect, one he would carry with him for a long time.